WCF Data Services is the technology formerly known as ADO.NET Data Services. You may also know it by its code name Astoria. And why were these things invented? Well, we find that applications increasingly use data services to find and manipulate data on the web. Back in the day when we didn't do a lot of retrieving data from the web, we just retrieved data internally from servers. All we needed was ADO.NET and the ability to talk to a SQL Server database somewhere on the network. But increasingly we get data on the web. And when you work with a service, you're going to pass a message to a service, some code running somewhere, and you're going to make a request of that service, which is, go get me something, data, a customer, a list of customers, whatever, a number, the current temperature, doesn't matter what it is, and the service passes it back to you. And increasingly, we're getting information and applications from the web. So applications use data services to find data on the web and manipulate data on the web. And once you get into this servicey type world, it's irrelevant, really, what presentation technology you're using. ASP.NET, WinForms, WPF, Silverlight, who cares? The service certainly doesn't know. And it's not like you call the service differently from a WPF application than from a Silverlight application. No, you're passing a message across the wire. And it also doesn't matter where the front end is located. I've got a Silverlight application or an ASP.NET application on a particular machine that's calling a service on that same machine that calls SQL Server database on that same machine, or I've got a WPF application on my laptop talking to a service on a server somewhere in Philadelphia that then talks to data in India. Doesn't matter. Technology-wise, it's all irrelevant. A computer is going to pass a message over the wire to another computer, which is going to do whatever it needs to do to get information and then send it back to whatever called it. So the goal of WCF Data Services was to easily create services on the middle tier that you could then easily consume from rich internet applications like Silverlight and Ajax. Okay, what's that got to do with WPF? Well, yes, the goal of WCF Data Services, or the goal of Astoria, was to create data services for the web, but remember, it's just a computer passing a message to a server somewhere. But remember, it's just a computer passing a message to a service somewhere, and it's regardless of the presentation technology. So sure, WCF Data Services were invented for web apps, but we can, as we will see, just as easily call them from client applications. Okay, so the goal of WCF Data Services is to create middle-tier services that can easily be called. And WCF Data Services, to do this, use REST. REST is representational state transfer, and it is an architectural style for getting information from a website. So what are the principles of REST? Well, the web is made up of resources. Whether those resources are text or images or XML, the web is resources. And resources are identified by URIs. So for example, here's a URI. Go to Wikipedia and look up WCF Data Services. If you go into your browser and you enter this, you'll go to a page on Wikipedia that shows you information on WCF Data Services. But that page is a resource, and then the individual things on it are resources. And then we can use HTTP verbs to access resources. Get, post, put, delete. So you want to retrieve information, you get it. And then one of the REST principles is that in web services, so in services on the web, you should be able to transmit data using plain old XML, also known as POX. In other words, there shouldn't necessarily be a need for an additional layer like SOAP. And ASMX Web Services and ASP.NET Web Services use SOAP, WCF uses SOAP, but you shouldn't need it. Why not? What's wrong with SOAP? Why would using REST provide a benefit over SOAP? Well, not all platforms support SOAP. Sure, .NET supports it, Java supports it, but not everything does. And not all services need support for transactions, security, reliability. Okay, if I'm updating orders via a service, I probably want support for transactions, security, and reliability. But if I'm calling a service to return the current temperature in Eden Prairie, I don't need transactions, I don't need reliability, I don't need security, I don't need all this additional stuff. And therefore, if you use REST, it's just plain easier to access services because all you need to do is type a URI in the browser. You want to see a list of customers? That's a URI. So those are the principles of REST. And then WCF Data Services is a way of writing a WCF service that dishes up data using REST. Now in terms of .NET and in terms of the code we write, WCF Data Services are in the system.data.services DLL. And they're based on an entity data model. So to create a WCF data service, you create a data model based on entities, and you'll use the entity framework for relational data. If you're going to write a data service that uses other data, then you'd use a custom link provider. In our demos, we're going to use the entity framework. And then each entity has a unique URI. So you could retrieve a single entity, like a single customer. You could retrieve one or more properties of an entity, so you want to know city, country, etc. You can get related entities, so you could get the products in a category. And then you can also filter result sets. So to create a WCF data service in Visual Studio, the first thing you do is create your entity data model. Then you add a new item based on the WCF data service template, and then you need to do two things. You need to point to the entity data model and grant read-or-write access to the entities. So configure which of the entities can be read or written to in the service. And then how do you call WCF data services from clients? You can use the WCF data services client library, which makes it easier to access these data services from .NET applications. And what it does is it simplifies the sending and receiving of HTTP messages. And then it translates the messages you send into CLR objects. So remember, one of the benefits of REST, and we'll see this in the demo, but one of the benefits is that all resources can be addressed by a URI. So to get a list of customers, you send basically a URI to the service, service/customers will bring back customers. Well, in my .NET code, I don't necessarily want to write an HTTP GET and specify the URI. I want somebody to write me a wrapper that will do that. And that's basically what the client library does. So I use familiar programming techniques. It then knows how to translate that into the HTTP GET to then send a request to the data service to bring back information which it then translates into instances of the customer class. Which, if you think about it, is exactly the same thing going on if you call a WCF service or a web service. So let's go see how to build a WCF data service and then call it from a WPF application. Let's create a WPF application that retrieves customer information from a WCF data service. So I'm going to start by creating a new project. And this will be a WPF application, and I'm going to call this Basic WCF Data Service Demo. Okay, I'll click OK. Here's the main window, which we will work on after we create the service. So now what I want to do is create my WCF data service. And I'm going to therefore add a new project to this solution. And I'm going to base this on an ASP.NET empty web application, because I want to create basically a website that will host my WCF data service, but I don't need all the additional stuff that comes with an ASP.NET application. So I'll just create a basic empty web application, and I'm going to call this Northwind Service. Okay, so now I have an empty website. It's just got web.config, and when I run this application, whatever I put in this website will be hosted using the ASP.NET Development Server. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is create my WCF Data Service. And I do that in 2 steps. First, I create my entity data model, then I create the service that uses those entities. So the first step is to add the entity data model. So I'll add a new item, and I'll go to the data templates, and I will select ADO.NET Entity Data Model, and this is going to use the entity framework. I'm going to call this Northwind. And I will click Add. And I have 2 choices. I can generate my entity model from a database, from an existing database, or I can start with an empty model. And this empty model is new in 4.0. It might have come out in 3.5 SP1, I'm not sure, but let's just say it's relatively new. I'm going to use a database, and I'm going to point to Northwind, and then I'm going to select my tables. And let's select customers and orders and order details and products and suppliers. We're not actually going to use all of these in this demo, but why not just add them? Oh, let's do categories as well while we're in here. Then I click Finish. And Visual Studio opens up the Object Relational Designer, and so here is my model. Let's zoom out so we can see everything. Some of these are hidden down here below. I'll drag those up so they're not hiding anymore. Come on, drag up. They won't drag up? Oh, one at a time they'll drag up, but not together they won't. How about that? Okay. Yikes. Yep, that goes to 100. Let's zoom out. Here's my model. So I have categories, and there's a one-to-many relationship between category and product. I have customers and orders and order details. There is a one-to-many relationship between customers and orders. There's actually a zero-to-many relationship because there are customers that haven't placed orders. But for each order, there's a one-to-many relationship to order detail. And then each entity has a navigation property. So this orders property references the collection of orders belonging to this customer. And then the order has a customer navigation property, which references the instance of the customer class that represents the customer that placed the order. So if I want to see the orders for a customer, I could say customer.orders, and that's a collection. If I wanted to see the name of the customer that placed an order, I could say order.customer.company name. So that's good. Let's save this. I don't really need to do much more with that. Now what I'm going to do is add the actual service. At this point, all I've created is my entity model. Now I'm going to create the data service. So I'll right-click on this project and select Add. I'll add a new item. I come down to the Web category, and then I scroll down until I find WCF Data Service. And I will name this Northwind WCF Data Service.svc. And then I will click Add. And Visual Studio has now added 2 references to this project, system.data.services and system.data.services.client. And then it gives me some boilerplate code here. I need to do 2 things at a bare minimum to be able to use this. The first thing I need to do is identify the entities. So I have this class Northwind WCF Data Service, which inherits from Data Service, but Data Service is a generic class, so I need to specify the entity set that contains my entities, and in this case that is Northwind Entities. So Northwind Entities contains all of my entities like customer, order, etc. So I need to do that, and then what I need to do is create rules that indicate which of the entity sets can be read or updated. So at the bare minimum, I need to, in this config, set entity set access rules, and then if I just want every client to be able to read or write to everything, so for this simple demo I just want every client to be able to read all the data. So I'm going to say all of the entities get entity set rights dot all read. So now what I've said is any client can read any of the data in the entity set, which is customers, orders, order details, categories, products, suppliers. Okay, so now I save this, I build this, and now let's test this. So if I right click on the SVC file and view in browser, then I get a list of the entities, categories, customers, order details, etc. That's a good sign. This is the equivalent to the test page that the browser would show if I was building a WCF service. So as always, if you get this far, that's very good news. Now, how do you call this? Remember that the goal of WCF services was to create data services on the web that were easy to work with and that follow the principles of REST. One of the principles of REST is that all resources have a URI. Well, categories is a resource. Customers is a resource. So I should be able to then do this. I should be able to come in here and select customers and see the customers. And in Internet Explorer, by default, I see nothing other than the date repeated over and over again. And I say, oh wait, what's going on? Well, I can fix this in Internet Explorer by going to Tools, Internet Options, Content, and then under Feeds and Web Slices, I select Settings, and then I turn off Feed Reading View. If you're using Firefox, actually I haven't tested this in Firefox, so if you get a similar issue, then you solve it in a similar manner. But I know this works in Internet Explorer. Then I refresh, and refresh. What happens if I go back and then forwards? There we go. All right. So now, when I pass this URI to the service, service.svc/customers, the WCF data service returns to me customers in XML. This right here is the crux of a WCF data service. This is REST. I passed a resource via an HTTP GET to the service, which then took all the customers, bundled it up in easily understandable XML, and just sent it back to me all at once. No soap, no additional quote-unquote baggage, just plain old XML. Now, what else can I do with this? Yes, I can see all customers. I don't want to see all customers. I just want to see alf key. So I pass in parentheses with a single quote, alf key, and now here's that customer. Ooh, what city is alf key in, you ask? It is in Berlin. I only want to see customers in Germany, you say. So let's go back to here, customers. So for filtering, I can do this. Question mark, $, filter equal substring of and then in parentheses, country, comma, quote, Germany, quote, close paren, send it, and now I only see the customers in Germany. You're starting to see, we're not done, but you're starting to see the benefits of REST, and you're starting to think to yourself, I am not in my code going to write this nonsense. There better be some .NET supplied wrapper that makes this easier for me. And of course there is. Alright, but let's continue on. But wait, there's more. I want to see the orders placed by ALF-key. So customers, particular customer, / orders is how you do one-to-many relationships. I don't want to see all of them. I just want to see a particular order for ALF-key, 10643. And if I just want to see order number 10643, I shouldn't have to go through customers, right? Right. So let's just get rid of this ALF-key stuff and just say, show me order number 10643. What are the details for that order? Order underscore details. Bring me all of the details for that order. There they are. Who placed this order, you ask? Order 10643 / customer brings back this customer. And remember, a little bit of entity framework or object model 101. We talked about this, but we just saw this. Each order has a customer property which references the customer that placed the order. So I can take advantage of that here by saying orders customer. All right, let's play around with different ones. I want to see my categories. So I can say categories. There are all my categories, including the XML representation of the picture. And then I want to see all of the products in a particular category. So here are the products in category number 1, which is beverages. And on and on and on. We could do this all day long. So that's basically what a WCF data service is, how we create one in Visual Studio, and then how we can query it. And we've now seen the primary benefit of WCF data services, which is not that you can write database queries in the browser. It is that you have a way of talking to data that follows the REST principles. So any client, whether or not it is .NET, can now pass this as instructions to the service and get back XML containing the data. We have now made this data service on the web addressable from every single client ever invented. As long as you can send an HTTP GET, and most things can, then you can get data back. All right, so now we're ready to come back into Visual Studio and call that service from this WPF client without ever having to type those gnarly looking URIs. Actually, they're not that gnarly looking, it's just a lot of code. We want to be able to call this WCF data service using familiar techniques. How about that? All right, so let's build our UI first. Here's our main window. We will call this customers. And we need it a little bit wider and a little bit bigger. Actually, a little bit less big. 500 by 500. And I want the window to start up in the center of the screen. And I need a loaded event there. All right, now what I want to do is display some information in here. I want a list box that will show me customers, and then I want to be able to see additional information on each customer. And we're going to keep this nice and simple. So let's see how fast I can type XAML. We want a stack panel. We want a list box. We'll give it a name. Customers list box. Actually, you know what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do this a little bit differently for a change. Here's a list box. Here's a text block. I'm going to use the properties window. I'm not just going to type XAML. Can you believe that? It's true. So here are the properties. I want to give this a name. So here's the name. Customers list box. I want to set its height to 400. I want to set its margin to 10. I want to set a border brush, and I want the border brush to be a single color. I want it to be black. That's the one I want. Let's do cadet blue just for grins. And then what do I want to be displayed out of here? The display member path is company name. And then when I select a customer, I want to do something. So we'll go to the events and we'll handle selection changed. I bet I can just press enter. No? Double click. There we go. Double click. And now come back to here and select the text block and give that a name of customer text block and set its margin to 10, 0, 0, 0. There. So if you've been using WPF for a while, or if you've been using Silverlight for a while, you're used to just typing lots of XAML, because in previous versions of Visual Studio, the design time tools weren't quite as nice as we wanted, and the properties window wasn't anywhere near as usable as we would have liked it to have been. So an entire generation of XAML developers has grown up knowing nothing more than typing XAML. And for somebody who's new to this stuff, you're probably going to spend more time in the properties window than typing XAML. Why would you type properties rather than just set them in the properties window? But for those of us who have been doing this for a while, we went the other way around, and so we have to train ourselves to potentially use the properties window more often, because it's way less typing. Alright, so anyway, now I have a list box and a text block, and I am now ready to write code and call the service and display customers. I'm almost ready. I need a reference to the service. Just as I would add a reference to a web service or a WCF service, I need to add a service reference to the WCF Data Service. So I will right-click here and add a service reference. Now if I know the address, I can enter it. But because my service is in the same solution, I can click Discover. Here it is. If I press the plus sign, Visual Studio communicates with the service, downloads the metadata, such as the name of the data set and the various entities in it. So I can now confirm that this is indeed the service I want to work with. I supply a namespace, which is going to be Northwind WCF Data Service, and I click OK. And now Visual Studio adds a reference to system.data.services.client, which is the client-side library I can use. It also adds a service reference to this. So here's the namespace, and if I show all files, in here is the proxy class that I'm going to use to talk to this service. Alright, so let's write ourselves some code. And I got snippets for most of this. WADT07 is my two usings, system.data.services.client, and then I add a using for the service references namespace. Then I want a couple declarations, WADT08. So I need a reference to the Northwind entities, which is my collection of entities, and then I want a reference to the customer class. And now, when the window loads, and there are a number of ways that you can query WCF Data Services. In the next demo, we'll look at additional ones. We're going to keep this as simple as possible right now. When the window loads, I'm going to do this. I am going to connect to the data service. So I create a new instance of Northwind entities, and I pass the URI. And then I can write link queries. And at this point, we are all very happy. Because I can just say, from cust in context.customers, select cust. So context is a pointer to my entity set, and I know what's in my entity set. So context has orders, order details, products, categories, customers, etc. So in typical and familiar link fashion, I can just reference the entities by context.customers, and then I can then write this simple link query that says select star from customers, basically. Bring back all the customers. And customers query is an iQueryable. I convert that to a list so that I can populate the list box, which knows to display the company name. And then when I select a customer, I know that the selected item in the list box is an instance of customer, but of course selected item is an object in my code. I cast it to customer, and then I display the customer ID, the city, and the country. And so now, let's build this, make sure it all builds. Good. Let's now call this service. Of course. When I wrote this, I hard-coded the port number. So when you add a web project, by default, Visual Studio says, well, I'll just use whatever port I come up with, which makes it then a little bit more difficult for me to come up with this canned code, because when I wrote this and I created the snippet, I was using 8095. So two things I can do here. I can change my service to use 8095, or I can just use 49270. So let's redo this. Was it 42970? I think that's what it was. 49270. Okay, let's try it again. Now I run this. Excellent. So now I have programmatically, in this query, done the equivalent of this. And so basically what's happening is when I create this query, and it actually runs when I call toList. When I call toList, the WCF Data Service client library crafts this message to send to the service, retrieves this, and converts it into an iQueryable list that I can then convert into a regular list and plug into my list box, which then displays the customers. And now when I click on each of these, because all the data is local, I don't have to go back to the service, although I certainly could. I can see information on the customers. So what you've seen is how to create a WCF data service in Visual Studio. We've seen how to call the WCF data service from the browser, so we've gotten a sense of what it means to be a data service out on the web. And then we've seen how in our WPF code we can just write a link query. We connect to the service and then write a link query, and then once the data comes back, we just go to town on it.